Okay, if everyone could take their seats, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, welcome back. I hope everyone had a good break. There's some snacks in the back, so make sure you're taking care of yourself and hydrating. The word of the day. All right, so we heard a lot of excitement about the different workshops, so let's give it a shout out for everyone that did the workshops last time around. We also heard some, which is great, some frustration saying, well, I really wanted to hear Patina, or I really wanted to hear Rosie. And so we're going to have an opportunity to hear from an extraordinary group of individuals working with survivors in terms of their own work. We want them to share really about We Choose All of Us and as an emergent strategy. What would that look like for our work that we're doing? So I'm going to invite the panel first to kind of go across and introduce themselves. We got mics that we're sharing. And share a little bit about, for the audience, the focus of your work and what you do. And then what would We Choose All of Us look like, feel like, and sound like for the work that you do? Nadiah, would you like to start? Yeah.
Okay. My name is Nadiah Mohajir. I'm from Chicago. I am founder and executive director of Heart Women and Girls. We are an organization that promotes sexual health and sexual violence awareness in Muslim communities through health education, advocacy, research, and training. And honestly, when I think about what does We Choose All of Us look like, I don't mean to sound cheesy, but it looks like this. It looks like a space of, you know, all different people coming together with different visions, but also with a common vision, and, you know, looking to uplift each other and sort of center the voices of those that need to be heard and want to be heard.
Hey, thank you. It's really hard to go first.
Thanks, Nadiah.
Hi, y'all. My name is Andrew Santa Ana, and I'm the Director of Legal Services at an organization based out of New York City called Day One. And at Day One, we work with young people aged 24 and under who've experienced dating or sexual violence in their relationships. And so we do a bunch of different kinds of services. I happen to be a lawyer, but that's not the most exciting thing that I do. We do our work very much from an intersectional lens that values not only the experiences of gender, but also poverty and of race and of immigration status and ability and health and education and all other axes of identity, which makes the work richer and harder and complicated and messy and beautiful at the same time. And when I think about what it means to choose all of us, I do very much want to lift up something that was said earlier about a movement being a lot of people with like different opinions doing the work, and wanting to lift up, if we are choosing all of us, recognizing the different strategies that we bring to the work. And so the workshops that I did today were about queer people and young people. And I think that if we are building a world together that looks differently, it means looking at how young people are organizing, or how young people are defining themselves, how queer people organize, how queer people resist, how people of color resist, and sort of learning those lessons, because those are strategies that are simultaneously unique and applicable for all of us. Yeah, so maybe that's a good starting point.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vanessa Sapien, and my background is in advocacy for folks with disabilities for my entire life. I was actually born with my disability, so I came out of the womb an advocate. And I have spent about the past 20 years as a film and television actress, so a big part of my work has been advocating for accurate portrayals of people with disabilities in media, film and television, so on and so forth. And for the past 10 years, I've been involved in the SA sort of DV movement, again, advocating for people with disabilities as well as all folks of all types of abilities. And I think when I think of We Choose All of Us, I also think about the work that I'm doing over the past year with Just Detention International, where I'm a senior program officer. And so for the past year, I've been working with incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse. And my being a person with a physical disability has really sort of helped to inform that work. And I think that's what We Choose All of Us is about for me. It's when all of us who are marginalized are sort of coming together and being in relationship with one another and are working together. And so my work inside of detention facilities in Southern California, I think is sort of how I would like to see that moving forward, and how I would like to see the movement moving forward, is all of us that are marginalized kind of working together. And also events like this where we can ask questions, where we can be in relationship, where we can be in conversation and be in dialogue, so that we can leave events like this as people who thought we knew to people who actually do know, because we were able to ask those questions and we were able to engage.
1 2 1 2. Hey ho. My name is Aisha Bain. I am a radical Black feminist warrior. How you doing? Sometimes a gentle giant, but mostly pretty fierce. And I also break out in spontaneous dance, which will probably happen on this panel. FYI. My work for the last 15 plus years has been working to end violence against women and girls in over 20 different countries. I've had the privilege to work with women and girls in many different capacities, from prevention, response, advocacy, and policy change. And I have recently co-founded my own company, Resistance Communications, working with the incredible and extraordinary power of women and girls to be able to tell their stories, and using creative tools and media to elevate the visibility and voices of women and girls in their social justice struggles. So very excited about that. Communities that include all of us. When I think about that, I think of so many things. But I think about who I would be if I wasn't fighting against violence against women. I think about who I would be if I believed that I was seen as a whole and full person in the United States of America. I think about who millions of people would be if they didn't live along multiple intersecting lines of oppression that affect all of their choices and all of their dreams and possibilities. And I think about what it would mean about what I could and what we could put out into this world, who would be, we would be, the choices we would have, the contributions we would be making if those forms of oppression were removed. And so when I think about communities that include all of us, I think about my life's work to work towards my liberation and the liberation of people of color, and that all of us may achieve our fullest potential.
Good afternoon, I'm Rosie Hidalgo, and I'm the Director of Public Policy with Casa de Esperanza and the National Latino Network for Healthy Families and Communities. So Casa Esperanza is based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. It's a shelter started by Latina women as volunteers when they saw that Latina survivors were not able to access services and safety the way they needed to. And so we're celebrating 35 years anniversary of that initiative. The shelter's still there and have a lot of folks doing local work, but we also expanded to do national work with the National Latino Network that was launched in 2009. And you know, one of the things we saw at Casa Esperanza is while a shelter may be necessary as a short-term Band-Aid thing, shelters aren't going to end domestic violence in and of themselves, and have seen really the need to go beyond that, to do a lot more work with engaging youth, engaging men, doing community engagement, promotoras and community leaders that can be part of this work. Like, how do we put this work in the hands of community and envision a healthy community? That's why we decided not to call ourselves sort of against domestic violence, but it's a National Latino Network for healthy families and communities. What are we about? What are we for? And I work in our DC office, which is me, doing policy work, but working with others all over the country. So our staff is, the national work is spread around, and shout out to some of my colleagues that might be here from Casa and the NLN, Rebecca de Leon, yay, who was previously with the Idaho Coalition, and Micaela Rios. I'm not sure if Micaela is here, but the Idaho Coalition has been so generous to share these fierce, fabulous young Latinas doing great work, who now are here in Idaho still, but part of the work of the National Latino Network. And so in terms of the policy work, you know, it's really how do we make sure, and I love the statement that was made earlier today about policy need to come from the ground up versus the top down. And I think, you know, that's part of what We Choose All of Us really needs to be about. How are we hearing the voices of different communities, marginalized communities, and unifying in our efforts from the ground up to try to change policy, to be responsive to those realities. And I had an opportunity to see some of that in VAWA 2013, and I do want to just sort of lift that up here. That when we worked to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act back in 2012, 2013, it was a hard-fought battle over 500 days where VAWA was not reauthorized because the DVSA community nationally kept saying we're not going to leave someone behind. There was this joint commitment across coalitions, across national organizations, as we worked as a National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. There had been a real intentional commitment, like who are some of the marginalized communities and what can we do, knowing that we couldn't get everything we wanted, but how could we advance? And so, for example, the special criminal jurisdiction for Native American survivors, which was so critical to recognize that tribal sovereignty and the rights of tribes to hold non-Indian abusers accountable on tribal land for their abuse. And that was a huge battle. And there were times when people said, you know, we could get VAWA done if you guys would just leave that part out for another day. Same with the LGBT provisions that were put in there to recognize for the first time in federal legislation a non-discrimination provision of the rights to access services regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, and other categories. But it was very bold to put that in for the first time in federal legislation and specific purpose areas. And I remember when we were meeting with some legislators, they're like, why are you all politicizing VAWA? We don't mind those people being served, but you just shouldn't put those words in there. And we're like, no, we need to, why are we rendering some communities invisible? We need to put it in there. Not that that in and of itself was going to change things, but it was a significant, important step to send a message that all survivors needed to be served. And same with immigrant communities. There were all kinds of attempts to gut and roll back protections for immigrant survivors. So I was really proud of the movement for VAWA 2013, that we realized that any of those groups by themselves, as people kept saying, if you just let that piece go, if you just leave that out, then we'll get it across the finish line. But the movement said no. You know, we need to stick together. We need to choose all of us. And I think we're up for that again. VAWA's, I hate to say it, up for reauthorization in 2018. We're all like, we're still overcoming the trauma, right, of what that was. But I think it is going to be an opportunity for all of us, again, to stand strong, to stand up. We would have preferred to be working towards a dream bill that would go further, a dream bill that would also create more options beyond the criminal legal system and a lot of other work that needs to be done. But I think that's what, to me, you know, we're going to have another opportunity as a movement now to really say we are not going backwards. We are not throwing anyone under the bus. We choose all of us, and everyone has a right to live a life free from the fears of violence and sexual assault.
Okay. That was a lot to follow, right? Lilan Pechuashe, it's a beautiful day. My name is Patina. I am from the Cheyenne River Lakota Nation. I am from the Minikushu Band, and I am very humbled to be on the stage with these powerhouses and in front of all of you. I am the executive director for the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. We're a 37-year-old agency now that serves the urban Native population, women and their families, which is everyone, right? Men, boys, Two-Spirit, children, and the Minneapolis area. We do a wide spectrum of services, but I sum it up by saying we address the trauma and harms caused by colonization through the loss of language, land, culture, identity, and just the overall trauma that we have experienced for the past few hundred years. When I think of all of us, for community, well, I think of all of us. So the messy parts of us and the mistakes and the things we learn from, and that as human beings we are all flawed, and that none of us are perfect, male, female, any gender in between, that we all are on a path to learning. And I have the opportunity and the blessing to work in an agency where we grow together and we help to empower and show others who are lost along that way how to move forward. I also think, including all of us, is also the difficult job of including those who are more challenging in the community. A lot of our family members we work with are angry and hurt and aren't necessarily grateful for our intervention. And so recognizing that the people on the street who are homeless and the people who are struggling are also part of our community, and that we can't leave anyone out, no matter how difficult they may be to work with.
Thank you, thank you. Such a robust panel. Thank you for that brilliant introduction. So one of the elements when we think about We Choose All of Us, I mean, it is about the wholeness in the way that Patina talked about, all of you, the imperfect parts, the amazing parts. It's also about recognizing that we do have this historical trauma that's happened over the course of hundreds of years in our country, and the repair that needs to happen from colonization and genocide and Western superiority and all of this. And so when I think about folks in Idaho and across the country who carry privilege, either because of the color of the skin or who they love or how they're able to move through the world, and the sense of both humility and responsibility that comes with that privilege, in terms of this emergent worldview of We Choose All of Us, any thoughts, recommendations? And we'll just popcorn it. Whoever has the energy to like wants to step in, move in, please do. Don't be shy. All right, Rosie?
Okay, great. I think right now in the moment that we're living in with the whole Me Too movement, right, that we're seeing, there's certainly been a discussion about, okay, people galvanized when they saw the white movie star actresses who had to, endure that kind of indignity to be able to get their positions, or, the white journalists at Fox News or others with prominent positions. And, I think that's part of the challenge right now. It's good that that's led to this discussion, and the Me Too has made people realize how critical this issue is. But how do we really make sure that we're lifting up all the stories and the intersections, and how those who are more marginalized, those who are perceived to have less power, are so much more vulnerable also to that kind of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. And I want to call out, Latina farm workers and immigrant farm workers in this country, farm worker women. And what was real powerful, I don't know if you all saw in Time magazine, they did publish a letter from 700,000 farm worker women in California who experienced really high levels of sexual abuse, sexual harassment, sexual exploitation. There was a film made by PBS Frontline called Rape in the Fields that really highlights how in this country we're willing to eat the fruits and vegetables that we're able to purchase at lesser price because, sadly, there's a lot of exploitation going on in this country of farm workers. And a lot of them are farm worker women who endure horrific levels of sexual violence. And those who commit the crimes do so with impunity, knowing that local law enforcement, local prosecutors will side with the big agribusinesses and not, protect farm worker women necessarily. So I think it was really powerful. They published this letter in Time magazine calling out their solidarity with the actresses of Hollywood, but at the same time calling out that while the actresses may nourish our souls with their films, that farm worker women nourish our bodies with their food. And how do we recognize this solidarity and say that no one to be able to work should have to endure sexual violence? And so I think it is a moment to lift up, these voices and to recognize the equal human dignity, right? That and see how we increase that solidarity, how people can just build on this moment, but to also say who are those that aren't being discussed, that are not perceived to have as much power. But I think there is this opportunity, and people are starting to make some of those connections.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. Vanessa?
Yeah, I think, I'm so proud of my community right now and folks in the entertainment industry that have been coming forward with all of the sexual abuse allegations and truth that's being talked about. But I think in relationship to media as an actor, I'm a part of a culture as a person with a disability where I believe in the power of media. I understand that what we see in television and in movies very much informs our worldviews and how we interact with folks. And so what does it say about us when we don't see ourselves reflected? And so for me, as a part of multiple cultures, but as a person with a disability, right now when I look at television and movies and in media, it says that I don't exist. And so if I don't exist, then how do people know how to engage me? And so I think that is sort of what I look at and think about when I think about privilege and what it means to be a what I call a vertical person. In terms of their level of engagement with me. And I think also thinking about accessibility, I think when we think about accessibility, we think about it in terms of physical accessibility. We think about it in terms of, I think that the symbol of the accessible wheelchair sign in parking very much sort of informs our worldviews when we think about accessibility. But it's more than that. It's about sight. It's about sound. It's about taste. It's about colors. It's about all these different things that we don't think about when we're offering services in our prospective offices. It's about having a scent-free environment and things like that when we think about the barriers that folks with disabilities are facing just to engage in the world. And so, I mean, really, it's just to engage,
Thank you. I wanted to complicate this a little bit, and because I wanted to lift up a couple of things that I've heard you say and Patina said about sort of bringing folks' fullness and their complexity, and also the importance of representation. I guess I'm speaking as a queer person of color, and thinking about what it is for choosing all of us in a way where queer people are fully seen and realized. And I think that the marriage equality movement teaches us many things, but amongst those things is that the message that resonates people are like an attractive like white couple, whereas queer lives and queer experiences are a lot more complicated, right? And so queer lives and queer experiences can also include domestic violence. They can also include like people hooking up in non-monogamous relationships on Grindr or in open relationships. And I think that when we talk about choosing all of us, that means telling the narratives, the ones that, of course, that are going to resonate and like tug at the heartstrings, but also the ones that talk about our stories as real and as sexual beings and as complicated beings, and for things whose experiences of sex or gender are going to fall outside of the things that are considered normative or usual. Right? So I think choosing all of us means embracing some of that, and also just some of the organizing strategies around that, or what are the lessons learned through those communities that allow, that have created more space. And so I've been reading more about like, sort of like HIV and AIDS activism from the 80s and 90s and the work of like ACT UP. And I've been thinking about like how on all these like sort of like queer dating apps, there's like, yeah, like I am into this and I'm HIV positive and or I'm negative and I like these things. And so I think choosing all of us also means making the things that like we don't usually talk about explicit. Because what is it to leave in a place to be like, yeah, I'm into this and that's real. And my community, when we didn't talk about that, like people died. People didn't give us services. People didn't fully treat us as human beings. And what does it mean for us to say, to include all of us and to include all of the representations that are full and beautiful and challenging, and create spaces also, not only for queer people, but particularly from my lens of working with young people, where young people can design and create visions of all of us that more accurately reflect like what they're experiencing, what's possible, rather than determine like this is what this could look like in maybe a sanitized or easy way.
Any other like thoughts or hard truths that folks need to hear? I know there's a lot, but yeah.
Just building on what everyone was saying, it makes me, when you talk about privilege, it makes me also think about power, and many things about power. Particularly about how we rethink about power, and can we think about power in a way that's beautiful. So right now we've got white people in this country who are holding onto power for dear life at any cost and every cost and the cost of millions of other people. And then we also have conversations that I've been in about race, and we have people who are white who hear that power and feel deep shame about that, and so want to step away from that power. I'm not one of them. I'm not part of that. So it makes me think about the reframing of power. That power is not the glorious thing about the 3 richest white men in this country that own more money and wealth than the entire bottom half of the United States. And we celebrate that as power. But what if power was something else? And that power was something that was beautiful when it was shared. And power was beautiful because you had choices and you had access, and you could be seen, and you could be heard, and you could be listened to, and you could be valued, and you could be believed, and you could be safe, and that was power. And we could share that power. It makes me think a lot about, let's not step away from that power, especially when you have privilege to already get there, because that is the dream. But how we use that power and privilege in support of others to achieve the same thing.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. So I'm thinking about, things that Andrew just shared about, like, really bringing all those conversations up and then recognizing all the representations and how beautiful they are, then thinking about power in a very different way. Are there other thoughts that come to mind that actually liberate all of us? Certainly relationship to power. Nadiah? Yeah.
What you said really resonated with me, and something that we're thinking about at Heart is this concept of reframing power as something positive, because we tend to think about power as evil and and all of that. But the line that everyone knows, with great power comes great responsibility. That's the way that we're thinking about power. And when we're working with religious leaders and community leaders to sort of train them to think about, how do we respond to sexual assault survivors? How do we respond to conflict in our community? Well, we respond to it because it's a God-given trust. And the word for that is amana. And we actually have this whole training around just the concept of amana, and it's a God-given trust that's been given, and it needs to be, like, very deeply respected. And that's sort of our way of thinking about, in Muslim communities, reimagining these power structures and rebuilding them so that it does feel like a shared communal responsibility and not just top-down.
I think more questions around our relationship to power. Where have you seen it work really well? Where shared power has been really alive in the space, in the organization, and the relationship? Or do we still have a lot of work to do?
No doubt we have does this work? Okay. No doubt we have a lot of work to do, but recently I had the opportunity to hear about the work going on in Immokalee, Florida, with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. I don't know how much you all are familiar with that initiative, but to me it was just beautiful, sort of what it means to recognize that power in the grassroots. And what happened, going back to the topic of sexual exploitation of farm worker women, in Immokalee, they did some massive organizing to really hold accountable the power structures of the farms, the farm owners that had so much power, and then those who purchased. And in this case, it was the tomato growers. And it had been identified that those farms were one of the ones with the worst levels of sexual exploitation, of workers that would be beaten, of people who were paid exploitive wages. And the extent to which the farm workers were able to organize themselves, but in solidarity with some who were working with them, and really create what's now called the Fair Food Program, and convince the growers that it would benefit everyone, that if they could sort of recognize the right to work with human dignity and create structures of accountability, where they trained all the farm workers themselves to be able to report, to know what their rights were, to do audits. They do their own audits that are done to be able to lift up where there is sexual exploitation, where people are beaten, where wages are withheld. And then essentially, they've got the first farm owner who stepped forward and said, yes, I will be a part of signing a legally sort of binding agreement that if their reports are made, they're going to hold accountable those who are perpetrating that kind of violence, because many times the farm owners would look the other way when the mid-level managers were perpetrating all that abuse. And they agreed to what's called a one extra penny per pound. So they said, if we can charge an extra penny per pound, gather that money, put in place programs, a 24/7 hotline, but really putting this work in the hands of community at the front lines to have power, because they've been given power in a way to be able to, they do these trainings on community, on the employer's time. They get paid to attend these trainings, to build their capacity, to be out there doing the audits, and now they've gotten all the tomato growers to be able to sign this agreement because they were able to get a lot of the powerful companies like Whole Foods and Taco Bell and all of them. They got 14 of them, Walmart and everyone, to say we're only going to purchase from the farms that have signed onto this Fair Food program, where they agree that anyone who perpetrates sexual violence, exploitation, what have you, will be held accountable. And so it's very powerful, because all of a sudden there's all this power in the hands of also the farm worker movement itself. But like they were saying, they found that just the farm workers protesting wasn't in and of itself going to make a difference. No one really cared. They said if farm workers protested, they do care if consumers protest, right? They do care if those who have the money are willing to say, no, we're not going to buy from you. So what's interesting about their program, and CNN just profiled it and did a whole thing on sort of this as an example, and they've now expanded to 6 states, to 3 other crops. Like, how do we build that power from the ground and give power to those who otherwise were considered powerless, and all of us be engaged in that as consumers as well. But what was interesting, too, when they were talking about this project, and Futures Without Violence has been working with them as well under an OVW grant to help support the part around ending sexual assault. They said the men, the farm worker men themselves, who initially were like, why is there all this talk about, sexual exploitation and sexual harassment, and there was sort of, have seen how much they have benefited too, because it also means less beatings in the field, less people like being exploited across the board in terms of wages. And they said like it's this joint recognition that if we work to end different layers of oppression, like we all benefit as a community. And even the farm growers, they say, now also recognize the tremendous benefits of a workforce, that is more invested, that isn't just, leaving. And so it's like, how do we recognize that when we share power, when we recognize human dignity, when we work collaboratively, that everyone sort of can benefit from that as well? So that was a recent example that really heartened, was this sort of a light in the midst of the darkness, because even if things aren't necessarily coming from a government that's supporting this, how do, from the grassroots up, we build these kinds of initiatives?
Any other thoughts about shared power when you've seen it work?
Well, I think just in response to your question earlier, Kelly, when you were talking about sort of ideas that liberate all of us, I think those of us that are a part of marginalized communities or identify as being a minority of some kind, there's this idea that kind of percolates in the way that we grow up, where we think that, well, all of those things happen to other people. Those things are what other people do. Those are not things that I will have access to as a minority or as a person that's marginalized. And I think a liberating question is, well, why not me? Who am I not to do those things? And so I think where my upbringing was a bit different is that I was raised by a warrior mother who always said, well, no, you're going to do what everyone else does. Who's here with me today, by the way?
Warrior mom in the audience.
Yes. Just saying.
Thank you, Gabby.
But I was raised by a warrior mother who never saw my disability, and so I didn't know I was disabled until I was like 6 years old, and a kid pointed it out. Like all of us, right, that are different or other. We don't realize that we're different until someone else asks us the question. But I think that was sort of the liberating question is, well, why not me? Why can't I be an actress? Why can't I be a wheelchair tennis champion? Why can't I be a grad school graduate and have a master's degree? And I think that that's a question that can really carry us really far. But I think also in relationship to my working with incarcerated survivors, I'm working with folks that they may never see outside of a prison cell for the rest of their lives. And so who are you not to have a full life? Who are you not to figure out how to make meaning out of your situation? And I think when we frame it that way, even those that we think will never be free are finding freedom, in a world that essentially isn't. And so I think that's sort of a key question is why not me?
Aisha?
First of all the yeses. You gave me a lot to think about. In this question you wrote about, you said about ideas that liberate us all. It makes me think a lot about the fact, I think about this a lot, so bear with me, that we're living in one big story. White supremacy is essentially a story that was created by people, that some people were of more value than others for economic and power reasons, and then everything that manifested from that story is what we're seeing and living in now. I think a lot about how we try to provide technical solutions to what are cultural problems. And I don't believe we can problem solve a story. I do believe we can interject other stories, more stories that are bigger, bolder, braver, more beautiful, true, that will push this dominant story into a corner and eventually into history. I think about the fact that we have been unable as a society in the US to hold multiple narratives and multiple truths. Every single person on this panel has a truth. It's all true. And our truths do not have to compete with each other. I think about how are we going to do that together? Every person in here has a story and they're all true. So I think about the fact that I, as a Black woman, family, immigrant family, all my other identities, can see another woman who is Mexican, trans, undocumented migrant. No, I do not know her story, nor do I do not know her experience, but I see her, I uphold her truth, and we share the same oppressor. And we share the same oppressive system, and where along those lines can we work?
Thank you for sharing that. It makes me think about the story about Me Too, right? That in 2007, Tarana Burke, a Black woman from the Bronx, created the Me Too campaign. And initially, when all of the white-centric media came out in October and November, that was getting lost, but then it's since been lifted up, which is amazing and what needed to be done. But what's the story that's not being told around Me Too? When you talk about stories that need to be told, what's the story that's not being told?
You know, I think the story that we need to continue to tell is about, or to lift up, is that I think we are seeing some changing of social norms, right? That's a bit of a tsunami that we've been waiting for. Not enough. There's still going to be a lot more work, but I remember when I was working, doing some work in Latin America we were trying to help pass some laws against domestic violence, and there was an attorney there in the Dominican Republic, and she said, you know, essentially this is like a three-legged stool. You know, you need to pass the law first, and it's really hard to pass the laws. But once you pass the law, you realize, like, oh my God, that was just the beginning part. Like, the next leg of the stool is the services then. Because there they finally had passed the law, but then didn't really have the services, the courts, and then, you know, you start, you know, she's like, so that's that leg of the stool, queda un poco cojo, which means, you know, that's sort of, you know, short and wobbly, but you're getting that together. But then the third leg of the stool, you know, she's saying, is how do we change the social norms? Because the reality is, it doesn't matter how many laws we have, doesn't matter how many services we put in there, those aren't the end in and of themselves. Like, those can't be the end. We're not, like, the end is not how to create more social services. It's how do we create social change? How do we create social transformation? And I think that sometimes our movement has lost sight of that. It's been about how do we create more social services and more money for more services. But that's not the end. And I think that, and then she was saying the social norms part, she's like, that patita queda, you know, really chiquitico, right? So the three-legged stool where the law might be a little bit longer, the services in the middle, but that leg of the social norms, you know, you're like, but I think we are sort of witnessing finally, but, you know, I recognize that the laws are important and even the services as part of changing that social norm. And so to me, what's been really empowering about the Me Too is to just sort of, and maybe it's also the power of social media now that people can more rapidly connect around things. Someone pointed out it's also we have more women in the media has made a difference. Because they were saying when O.J. Simpson happened in '94 and there were some stories in a moment, a lot of those articles were not being written by women. Not, you know, you didn't hear the voices of women of color also. And so we suddenly have, I think, women's voices are being lifted up in a powerful way. And, you know, so how do we keep building on that? Because I think ultimately that changing of the social norm, those switches, and seeing young people who just really aren't going to tolerate this BS any longer. Like, I think, right? It's just, my hope is in the young people, and I think they are a tremendous part of this movement. And I read an article too where they said, you know, a lot of the women who, you know, voted for someone who had been, you know, caught on tape, sort of bragging about being a sexual predator, you know, part of the reason they said, like a lot of women are like, yeah, but that just happens. It happens. It's happened all my life. I know men all over who've done that. Almost like that notion, like, it's just the way it is. So why are we not going to vote for this person? Not just because of that. like was almost rationalized. And I think we now have this new generation that is not going to accept that. And, you know, and these norms overall, even, you know, to other generations, like we're just like flipping a switch. So, but the question, of course, is how do we make sure we're lifting up all voices, you know, and not just women, of course, but also men and boys who are affected, especially by sexual violence as well. Some of the things we don't talk about is childhood survivors of sexual abuse. That's still very much taboo in our society, even though we know it's a huge problem. So I think, you know, we're getting to a point where people can at least talk more about these issues, but we need to make sure that all the voices and experiences, and then the other part that's missing is, like, what are the solutions, right? How do we move from #MeToo to #RealChange, right? And it's not clear that the current solutions are always the best ones, right? We know a lot of people don't want to get engaged with the criminal legal system, that want transformative justice or restorative justice, things we're just beginning to talk about. So but it's like, how do we move into what these solutions are going to look like?
Yeah. Patina, I sat in some of your workshop, and so I'm curious, because I just think about Patina shared kind of the arc of the history of colonization in our country and the clear intention to sexually assault and sexually harass Native women. And so in this moment in time, what does Me Too mean for Indigenous women who experience the highest rates of sexual assault in our country?
Yeah. There's an interesting dynamic that goes on, and it's something I continually have to kind of process in my head because, you know, as we were speaking about privilege earlier, there's another privilege that exists in the Me Too campaign. You spoke of it in that white actresses brought it forth, and then everyone jumped on board, and someone had to raise, hello. Actually, black ladies started this some time ago, right? You know, but there's also that a white woman can say, you know, he grabbed my ass, and get the same level of attention and horror and calls when my community has experienced sexual trauma for 500 years. And for most of the women I work with and my family and friends, you know, sexual violence occurred around 10 to 12, right? It's a deeply embedded multi-generational, multi-family effect. And so there is a privilege there that, we have been dying and screaming for generations, and yet our data is not included, our stories aren't being told, because it speaks to a broader issue of the history of this country. It's easier to not look and to raise other people's liberation than our own. And so, at times I participated in Me Too, right? I mean, Me Too for every decade of my life, but my most recent. I mean, and so, but I'm at the point too of Me Too, okay, now what, right? I mean, our resources going to be diverted to really address based on the harm and the disparities, right? Because if that were the case where I'm from in Minnesota, the bulk of the money would go to the 2% of us that are being affected the harshest by every measurable health, crime, death by police, everything, at the expense of other communities. And so it creates this arena where we have, the Olympics on who's the worst, right? I mean, and we fight amongst ourselves when at the end of the day, I look at a colleague who's a white woman who experienced an incident of violence. She has a whole nonprofit, has raised all this money, has a plaque going up in a park about her trauma, because so many people are horrified that she was traumatized, when all you have to do is drive around 6 blocks of an area half a mile from my agencies, and you can see that trauma happening in front of your face and no one is looking. So it's, the invisibility that occurs is overwhelming and really soul crushing at times.
Aisha?
Thank you for that, Patina. There are so many things that Me Too brought up for me. So many. First, a shout out to Tarana Burke for what she started essentially for women of color who experience sexual violence. and wanted to create a way that they could be seen, be heard, be believed, be valued, and not be alone. 10 years later, it took a white woman, wealthy, respectable, educated, to call to light what women of color have been screaming out for centuries. And then to pursue a white man, and more white men have been coming to light. And let me be very clear, this is not about being decisive. My life's work is to support survivors of violence from everywhere, every way, and to end this violence. It is also about acknowledging truth. So let's be truthful. This type of violence is not new. This country was founded on this violence. Violence against brown and black women's bodies is as American as baseball, except they bat it around with women's bodies and lives and dignity. From the genocide of Indigenous women to stomp out a people, to breeding and raping black women, to create more free labor, to forced sterilizations. This country has been founded on that, and then all the violence that happens in every which way to women's bodies, millions of them. And so when I think about this, and I think about what that has meant from the past to recent days, I think about everything Patina said. I think about Anita Hill. I think about the number of women of color it took to bring Bill Cosby to the light. Black women and a black man, not same value. R. Kelly. And if you don't know who that is, a musician for years where girls and women have been bringing the violence that he has perpetrated to light. And he is out there making millions. I think about the farmers, the domestic workers cleaning hotels and restaurants and waitresses and bus drivers, and the millions of women of color who have been shouting from the rooftops. And intrinsically, this makes me look at and think about who is of value, who is of worth, and who is disposable. 1787, a law by the US government said that black people were 3/5 of a person. By every measure of society that I see today, I know for a fact that I am still not fully human. So many things I wish I'd seen when that new viral campaign came out, right? And all of the posting, and with every posting of every white actress and woman and person and man that were posting about this, I wish that there had been a hand-in-hand posting something about women of color. That the practice became hand-in-hand like breathing. You've got 3 stats you keep in your pocket that you pull out everywhere, all the time. Every conversation, every meeting, every article, every social media post. People will get tired of you for bringing up women of color. But I promise you, not as tired as we are living it. I think the power in Tarana Burke's Me Too campaign and what it was built for is that in the wave, in the tidal wave, in the tsunami of women and men and LGBT survivors that came forward, was this undeniable feature that this is not about individuals and what an individual survivor did or did not do, but that we are forced to look at the system, the systemic problems and the systemic solutions required from all of us.
Thank you, Aisha. So, Patina, you brought up I think an important issue, like how do we shift our narrative from one of scarcity to abundance? And when we're thinking about the repair of the harm from violence in our communities, what can we build on? What can we reimagine in terms of real solutions? What are we thinking about?
I think one of my biggest frustrations working at a rape crisis center for 10 years and being an advocate is a big part of that process is the referral process, right? Eventually the sessions are going to end, the support is going to run out, and we need to find other places for survivors to go. And I think one of the biggest lies that we tell ourselves, or one of the biggest assumptions that we make, is that the agencies that we're referring out to are trauma informed about what it means to be a survivor of sexual abuse. And so that's one of my biggest fears, is that then, so what are we doing? You know, it's not just about doing our job to the best of our ability in a rape crisis center, or as being advocates for those that are experiencing sexual violence, but also reaching out to communities and other agencies that maybe are not doing that work at all, who still need to be informed about this kind of violence. And so for myself as an educator, when I go and I speak to universities and colleges, and people that are just a part of a bunch of different programs that want to learn about disability, I'm always sort of including components of, and this is sort of the type of abuse that people with disabilities can be facing, and these are the entry points in which it happens. And so then that opens up this dialogue and this conversation where they think that they're going to hear a talk or a conversation about cultural humility or cultural competency about disability, but really kind of inserting that larger conversation about violence and sexual abuse and sexual trauma and DV and all of those things, and sort of broadening the conversation in that way, and then getting referrals and people asking, oh, hey, can you kind of talk to my agency about that as well? And they're agencies that seemingly have no connection, but there's always a connection. And I think every agency out there that's just dealing with people and servicing people, human beings, that this is something that needs to be talked about, that it can't just rely on the agencies who have sexual abuse in their title, but just all agencies in general.
Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah. I feel like everything that's been said is so powerful that I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? I've been reflecting. I think I'm trying to make some connections between some of the things that were said, and I've just been thinking about the nonprofit industrial complex, specifically around the idea of, like, I think what you said, Rosie, like, we need a law, and then we need services, and then we need culture change, versus, like, going straight for culture change in ways that, in some ways, it's very important that those things are funded, and other ways that involve investment in each other as agents of change that don't necessarily involve funding, right? So, or can involve incredible work and organizing and faith and challenges and all other kinds of deep and meaningful conversations. But I think I worry, as someone who's, is a practicing lawyer, how much we rely on the solutions, meaning legislation, which often means criminalization, which means often allocation of resources to people who are determined to be experts, and then they can sort of pass that along. And I think there are elements about those models that are important, but not always, and they're not the only way to do the work. And so that when we think about solutions, what does it mean to hold choosing all of us and Me Too, and like thinking about what is it to bring all of us and to require all of us to know when, I'm a service provider, and I've been working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, young people and LGBTQ people for a decade, and I am also was conditioned to be complicit in violence against women as a cisgender male, right? And so I guess I'm just like raising this because I think that the solution certainly involves partners, but also things that I don't even know what the exact solutions are, but I know that they take place in community. And so the idea of like white saviors or outsiders coming in and being like, I'm the expert on this, versus uplifting the strategies that people have been using for a long time to address harm in their relationships. So that speaks to transformative justice and community accountability, and recognizing harms that aren't only tackled by legal remedies and criminalization.
That's great. Aisha, I want to go back. You had such a powerful sharing just a few minutes ago, and thinking about, in a perfect world, when Me Too came up, we would have heard about the experiences of women of color and Indigenous women and folks with disabilities and the queer community. And I think about the privilege that the white women had and be able to share their stories. And so how do we overcome like the barriers that people have in our culture based on the ways that we devalue individuals based on identities and characteristics, and how can we do that work in the way that you're envisioning?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, thanks. No, I'm just thinking, when I think about Me Too and the white women that were coming forward, they came from a place of privilege, and I'm assuming economic privilege, where they weren't worried about job security, and I just think about the barriers that historically marginalized communities are going to experience in terms of coming forward in the same way. And so how do we how do we shift the narrative? Because I think you're sharing around stories and the power of stories and what stories are told to create culture change is so powerful. But how do we do that in a way without overburdening people from marginalized communities that are already burdened just by having to move through the day?
Thank you for that. Yes. Several things are running through my mind. Part of what angered me about Me Too was the demand on survivors to once more disclose. And it wasn't part of Tarana Burke's original campaign, but there was that phrasing that went around with the Me Too post that was something like, post Me Too so that people know the magnitude of the problem. That was something like the phrasing. Does that sound familiar? Okay. It was like, demand survivors to once more tell you their problems so that people know the magnitude we already know. The magnitude of the problem. What? Toe fungus? What problem? We couldn't even name the problem in the very post that went around, that went viral. It drove me completely mad. It drove me completely mad in what it asked me to do. Did I post? Yes, I did, along with a rant around Me Too, and I'm angry that it's Me Too. And I'm angry that so many Me Toos are flying across my screen once more, and I'm angry that we're not talking about who's causing the violence and how we're shifting it. When I think about stories, I think of the stories that we can create, not just the ones that we have to breed out of ourselves and exploit out of ourselves that have to deal with these kinds of violence. I think about the visioning. Let me back up. I think about, where do we want to go? I think about often how our strategies and tactics are looking to move the current ship, change that direction, maybe build an extra room or extra sail on top. And that ship was never, ever built for all of us. When we say include all of us, that ship was never built for all of us. The way that our systems and our government and society was structured was never built for all of us. So I think about where we're going. And I think about, what does gender equity look like? What does racial equity look like? For the individual, for the family, for the community, for our society. Because if we don't know what it looks like, and don't get me wrong, people do. And there have been visionaries for a long time, and we follow visionaries because they can see it and they can smell it and they communicate it and we believe. But our systems have changed. And our societies have changed purposefully by, I'm gonna say it, the man. Who designed it so that hope would be privatized, that capitalist structures would change the way that we function, and that communities would no longer be necessary. We wouldn't need each other, we'd only need ourselves. And so our mobilizing changed around that as well. Therefore, we have tactics and strategies that we're using now, and my question is, where are we going? Because the average person, I believe, in America does not know what gender equity and racial equity look like. And I think about, when I think about stories and interjecting new stories, I think about the visioning that we do with communities to build those visions and create these visions and these stories about, this is where we're going. This is what it means for all of us. This is what it looks like for all of us. This is what we all gain, not what a few of us lose. And I think about those stories as the real truth, that we are like, this is what we're about as humanity, as a society. This is what we're working towards, and those are the stories I think about when I think about how we push white supremacy into history. And I just wanted to say, have you guys seen the study from Yale about fear and conservatives? Anybody? Study from Yale? Yeah, a few people? Okay, this thing is fascinating. Study that was done by Yale. And they looked at liberals and conservatives and what made all the difference in terms of how they voted or what they believed, immigrant policies, what have you. The underlying factor was literally physical harm, fear of physical harm. In the brain, the part of the brain that stores fear or that controls fear is the amygdala. And they mapped it. And then in conservatives, the amygdala was larger than in liberals. Literally. So you have liberals who had been talking about the only thing to fear is fear itself. And you had conservatives talking about the Muslim ban, the wall, terrorists, LGBT, you name it. Who you can fear, why you should fear it, you are in physical harm. And that affected how conservatives believed and voted. When they changed some of the factors about physical fear, conservatives were able to change their mind. This thing about fear, physical fear, safety, how we've been, I guess when I think about what liberates us as an essential tool, I think about truth. You know, and of course it's been controlled in so many ways, but I think about truth and how we've been manipulated by fear and what that's literally, and how that's been controlling our political and social structures.
Vanessa?
Yeah, I just wanted to tack onto that really quickly and to say that, you know, as an actor, you're at your core, you're a storyteller, right? And so I sort of left that industry behind to work with incarcerated survivors, and to me that made perfect sense because you're never going to come across people with greater stories and more lived experience than the incarcerated community. But I think kind of to tack on to what you were saying in terms of storytelling and rethinking the way that we approach these issues is also a lot of what we do is built around supporting survivors that come forward. But what about going into communities where we know it's happening and not asking people to necessarily come forward? And so the work that I do with incarcerated survivors, the way that it's structured is that I go into these facilities, and I predominantly work in a women's facility in Southern California, the California Institute for Women. And at CIW, they know that I'm there, my presence is known, they know what I'm there to do. And so people then have a safety net where they can then come forward in a confidential manner where it's not going to get reported to the institution, where nobody who works inside the prison is going to know that they're a survivor and they don't have to identify as such. And simply by showing up at my door, they're saying enough. They're saying it all because they know what it means to come and see me. They know what it means to qualify for my services. So there's no disclosure necessary. And so again, also working with people with disabilities, I know where they are. You know, I know where they convene and I know where to go. And to just go and say, I'm an advocate and I advocate for people who are survivors of sexual abuse, that opens up a whole window of stories of people that are able to come forward and say, oh, I've experienced this too, but I didn't know who to talk to. And I didn't want to have to open up about it in a specific kind of way. But I think also too, not just as a person with a disability going and speaking to folks who have disabilities, but also bringing people with me who don't identify with the community, so that folks know, hey, you have nothing in common with me, but it's nice to know that you care. And as somebody, as part of the free world, going into an institution where I can't relate to that experience at all and saying, but I'm here to help. And I think that's really powerful too.
Thank you for lifting all those ideas up in terms of how we can really begin to repair the harm of trauma and community and truth-telling and storytelling and the sharing of power. I mean, these are all just really, I think, viable solutions. Rosie?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things I want to add is one of my earlier mentors in this work was Julia Perilla, Dr. Julia Perilla in Atlanta, and she herself was a survivor. And in doing the work, you know, with community, really realized, like, what does it mean to hear and listen to the voice of community? And we always say we listen to survivors, but do we really? Do we really hear what they're telling us, what they're really asking for? So when she started this program in Atlanta called Camina Latino, she said, you know, the women said, who's working with the kids? Someone needs to work with our kids and not just put them in front of a video or whatever, but actually help them with their trauma. So they started a program with the kids and with the adolescents and actually taught the young people how to do participatory research themselves. These young people have gone on, and some of them even undocumented, have just become these great presenters, have done amazing research. But then the women were saying, well, who's working with the men? You say it's not our fault, you know, that there are these lack of gender equity, there are all these problems with power. And, you know, the response at that time was like, you know, no, we don't work with the men, we work with women. But victim survivors have been asking for a long time, like, how do we do this work differently? And when Julia started doing that work, then because the women said, look, you learned how to work with women and with kids, like we now need to figure out how to do this work with men differently. And they started in Caminar Latino to work with the men. You know, initially people were like, oh, that's bad, that's dangerous, that, you know, that's not accountability. But I think we're in a place too, like if we're looking at what does it mean to choose all of us, if we're looking to really end this, if we're looking to move towards gender equity, how do we begin to realize, like, how do we do this work with those who've caused harm in a different way? And we talked about trauma-informed approaches with survivors, but are there trauma-informed approaches with those who cause harm in our community? And, you know, that saying that hurt people, right? And not to excuse their violence, not to say we're not holding them accountable, but what does it mean to make sure that those who cause harm take responsibility for their own healing so that they stop causing harm as well? And is there a way to do that and still, you know, hold them accountable? So I think, like, you know, some of the new ways we need to move forward. And Julia was saying, too, when she would work with the men's group, they always made sure there's a woman and a man together to model that and to make sure. But, you know, she said, as we went around, we would always, at the beginning of each week, check in with our own violence. And she said, you know, it's very important for me to check in with my own violence. You know, and I sort of look at her, I'm like, Julia, you know, I have her up on this pedestal. You know, what do you mean check in with your own violence? And she said, you know, all of us have privilege. All of us have a certain amount of power, even though we're also, you know, survivors. We're also, as a woman of color, she had experienced depression. But again, she had gotten a PhD. She was running this program. And she said, you know, we can't do this work and really move towards a new paradigm if we're not all checking in with our own power, with our own control, with how we present at work, in our families, in our communities. And I think that is something that is so powerful, I think, in the DVSA movement, where, you know, we need to do that work. Because sometimes we talk about, oh, power and control and the problems out there, but unless, you know, because you said, how do we move from the scarcity framework to one of abundance? I think part of that is even within our own movement. How do we make sure that we're centering marginalized communities? How do we make sure that we're focused on, like, we're not all in our silos, but we're focused on the last girl, right, as you all have talked about it with the MOVE cohorts. Like, if, you know, Gandhi's phrase there about, if you look at the most marginalized person and we figure out how are we going to serve them, then everyone will be served, right? Versus if we start from the perfect victim, the white middle class, you know, educated woman with resources, and we figure out how to serve her, a lot of people are left out. And then there are add-ons, and they're on the periphery, and we throw some crumbs to a culturally specific thing there and an underserved there. But if instead, like, all of us as a movement said, wait a second, is that about power and control, you know, of who we're choosing to center and prioritize, and then whatever remaining scraps go to add on some of this? How do we rethink within this of that focus on the most marginalized person and go out from there? And I think that will lead us from scarcity to more abundance.
Nadiah?
Always happens to me. I think the only thing that I would add to that is, you know, moving, like you said, from this us versus them kind of mentality, and thinking about intersectionality, how you said, but also cross-movement building. I think that's really important. And another way to sort of increase the abundance of people who are committed to ending gender-based violence.
Yeah, I would just add, I've been thinking a lot about not only intersectional oppression, but also intersectional liberation. And I think what you were saying, Aisha, like the story of white supremacy, what if the stories that we all told were the stories of solidarity and cross-movement building, right? And so I'm the child of immigrants. My parents are from the Philippines. And what if we told the story of the, you know, sort of 1968 post-civil rights bill immigration amendment changes were that allowed for my parents to come were very much rooted in black liberation struggles or very much rooted in anti-slavery things. So what if we told that story more deeply, just so that actually, like, the white supremacist narrative is the minority one and the dominant narrative is the one where people have actually seen humanity in other people and made those connections. The story that I always share around that is, so I was born and raised in Staten Island, which all of you know is kind of a complicated place. It's a borough of New York City that is unfortunately the most conservative, but there's lots of really vibrant immigrant Liberians, Sri Lankan, and other Latinx communities of color who are organizing. And I served on the board of the LGBT Center in Staten Island that's across the street from where Eric Garner was placed in a chokehold and killed. And after that, there was all of this organizing that was done sort of around that area, in which all of these young people from the LGBT community center, who some of them were queer youth of color, but also sort of like white cisgender seniors, were marching with like BLM or Black Lives Matter organizers for days, like even in times that didn't make news coverage. And what if we told that story more? What if we highlighted those intersections? What if we had a process for which we saw each other as human beings? And what is it to shift that narrative? Because in fact, that is actually incredibly abundant, right? There is no shortage of stories and of examples of people using what their access point is with power and privilege to support other movements. And how do we teach that? Which I think is partially what we're doing here, but I think that's how we rethink and redefine power is to take it, but take it in a way that like spreads it around. And I think strategically, again, if we're like thinking about movement building, how do we use the resources based on the privileges or access that I have as a highly educated cisgender male, but use that leverage while also problematizing it to allocate resources and support for other communities. So yeah, thank you.
That's great. I want to take some time to open it up to questions too. And while you're, I want to make sure we have mics, Yara. Yeah, I saw you there. Questions, and while we're getting a couple questions from the audience, just in terms of so many different hopeful things are coming up in terms of community building, truth-telling, storytelling, making sure we're lifting up the stories we need to lift. And while we're waiting for a question, is there a way that you're manifesting hope by truth-telling, storytelling, being in community, going out into community that you'd like to share?
I think one incident that gave me a lot of hope, that manifested hope, was you all might be aware of the case that happened in El Paso at the courthouse when an immigrant survivor went to get an order of protection and ended up being detained by ICE. And what to me was so powerful about that is going back to like the most marginalized survivor you can think of. This was a woman who was an undocumented immigrant, transgender woman who had a criminal history, who had previously been deported, who was a victim of domestic violence by her partner, who was trying to get an order of protection. And I was thinking, wow, if you look at all the intersections of oppression and of marginalization, like this survivor at some level really embodied that. And when ICE went into the 10th floor of that courthouse because the abuser had notified them that she was trying to get an order of protection and detained her, the way the community mobilized to support her. And it was the white woman who ran the DV program that had taken her to court. It was the prosecutor, it was the judge, it was the media, it was the community. And it was very powerful because people could have been like, oh, well, we're not going to get involved with that person who's, not a perfect victim. But that gave me great hope. And what was interesting is that ICE initially said that they had detained her outside the courthouse. And the court even released the surveillance video. They're like, oh, no, there were 6 of you. You went into the 10th floor. You went to the protection order hearing room. Here's the video of you taking her out. And then the prosecutor, the judge, and the DV shelter person held a press conference. And that prosecutor said, I've worked here 23 years. Never have I seen, ICE come up there. They're like, we don't have second-class survivors here. She was entitled to an order of protection as a victim of abuse. Like if ICE has to do whatever enforcement they need to do that somewhere else, but don't compromise the ability of survivors. And as we were meeting around this, and we had some meetings in Washington, and we get some pushback and some backlash, as you can imagine, from some people are like, why are you lifting up this case? And we were saying, because, the reality is, even if this person had a criminal history, by virtue of being an individual in the community she's with, we know that transgender individuals experience more criminalization, right? As someone who had previously been deported but came back, we knew that there's a good chance she's fleeing horrific levels of violence based on a number of issues, like recognizing the layers of oppression and marginalization, and that if the message that was sent that the community would mobilize was to say, because if we didn't also just even the chilling effect for others to say you can't come forward. So how did everyone recognize like the need to, by standing up for her was also standing up for all survivors? And what's interesting, I recently saw someone from El Paso, and you know, ICE technically still can go into that courthouse, but they've backed off tremendously. And even like with orders of protections around the country, you know, we know it's still a concern where they're showing up in courthouses. But I think the backlash of the media and the grassroots and everyone was so tremendous that they're almost like, it's not worth all the hassle, you know. But to me, that was hopeful. That was powerful. To me, that showed we are making progress as a field, as a movement, to say, how do we lift up our voice for the most marginalized? So I do see hope, even in the midst of this difficult circumstances that we're dealing with.
That's great. That's great. Let's take some questions from the audience. Dalton's got a mic there. Thank you, Dalton.
So Andrew was talking about the need to, you know, intersectional movement building, and then we were also talking earlier about, you know, our troubled past, you know, our genocide against, you know, Native Americans and you know, slavery and such. So how do we try to build those intersectional movements, but not leave out potential allies by using, you know, because something I had written down, I can't find it now. Was, I'm sorry, I can't find, the country was founded on, you know, this sort of terrible past. So how do we try to build those, you know, like, you know, gain supporters without losing people through that language?
I was just thinking of an example from college. So that was 20 years ago. But anyway, so in college I did a lot of organizing around anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian racism. And there was an incident in which an Asian college student was sort of jumped and called names like chink and gook, and sort of he was like knocked unconscious. And there was a lot of intersectional organizing in which Asian American groups and Latinx groups and black folks and a bunch of religious groups were organizing around the idea of, like, what is it to support the survivor? And I remember there was like, well, what do we do with the fraternities and the sororities, right? Because there's like often these groups that were like, that wanted to be supportive, but often like are really bullying for many queer folks or many API folks. And I remember in one of those organizing sessions, it was thinking about like, what is those individuals' access point? And so, in that instance, I'm sorry, I wish I had more of like a gender-based violence example, was that like the leaders of those fraternities were actually trying to do their best to understand the problem, and what we just had them do was security, right? We're like, y'all form the perimeter around the POC, like, and the queer folks and the API folks who are protesting, and then we'll invite you to meetings later. All of that to say that I think that everyone can play a role from what their vantage point is, and I think it's the question of strategically building alliances and creating an access point for others to know like where their privilege sits, and creating a point where like that is useful, and then not ending there and then recreating that dialogue. So sorry that's like not like a gender-based violence example, but that was the one that came to my mind when I think about not shutting people off, but also what is it to you know, like open up that dialogue in a way that says, you're completely fucked up and you're disposable and I want nothing to do with you, right? If we're saying we choose all of us, it's saying that all of us come with baggage, and like and we can have that conversation later, and I want to recognize you as a whole person who has perhaps experienced your own trauma and has been either complicit or benefited from structural like white cis hetero patriarchy, and I need you for this, right? So I mean, in the immigration organizing that I was doing in law school, there was also like, okay, so the people, we want to create movements for protests where undocumented folks can participate, and for all the folks who can put their bodies on the line in ways that undocumented folks can't. Again, what is the perimeter that they're creating? How do we organize and mobilize those folks? So what does it mean to show up in solidarity when you know that potentially there could be consequences for you, but also they might not be as great for you as they are for people who are directly impacted? And so, and then what conversations does that open up around power and privilege and solidarity? So I would say that, like, I think all of those situations are unique, and I would love for all of y'all to think about other examples, but they're totally out there all the time. You know, when I think about, like, oh man, again, college was 20 years ago. Like, when you think about like all the things that I just use, like, okay, I'm a lawyer, I work in the legal services world. Like, when I think about, I work with young women of color who are survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and we work with big firms, like big fancy law firms where associates make like, I don't know, $175,000 a year. I take all their office supplies when I'm there, right? Like, they give me all their office supplies. I'm just saying the nonprofit struggle is real, and then I think, and capitalism is real, but there are access points where people have those things, like, you can go for it and like get that pass. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but you know, there are people with like a wink and a nod who like will let you, you know, like use what those resources are. And I've seen those fall along lines of like gender and race and education and, you know, like even in New York City, like what does it mean to swipe it forward if you haven't like a Metro card and swipe rides for other people who are trying to get on the subway who might not have access to it. Like, I think that they're large and small acts of solidarity that don't necessarily involve stealing office supplies, but involve like recognizing like okay, like there's a deeper conversation about capitalism and structural power and oppression, and I'm open to having that conversation, and you have the resources to help me this way, and if you were committed to this, like, let's talk about it, let's work this out, let's find another strategy, and we'll continue that conversation. Does that make sense? Cool.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew.
Kelly, I'm actually super interested to hear your answer to this question. Well, I'll just share a thought. I want to thank the young man who answered the question, who asked the question. I think about a lot of things. I just wanted to share a few. So I think about truth. And as we move forward for the communities that we want to build, that my hope, I'll speak for myself, is that we can work from that place of truth. So that when we're talking about solidarity, right, this word that we're hearing a lot about, there is a deep and beautiful meaning in this world, in this word, that we can be brave and bold in our acknowledgments of truths. I think part of the pain that happens now and the disfracturing of our movements and our societies is that we're working from different truths about history, and that is painful. And to not have those acknowledged is very painful. And therefore, we're not starting from the same place from moving forward. I think a lot of what I hope for is that we're able, in solidarity with each other, with me, with Chicanas, with LGBTQ movements, with all kinds of movements, with white movements, the same. That we are in solidarity is a brave and boldness to recognize truths of history and start from the same place that we can move forward together. So I wanted to share that. I think about, I just lost my thought. Too many things happening in there. Something. Oh. Darn it. Oh. Well, I'll give you a different one. So, joy, pump it up, keep it going. Sorry. Bust it out. Sunshine and rain, sing it loud, no sugar. Sometimes in solidarity, you got to sing it out because it feels so good and all this stuff. Okay. I think about solidarity in dancing and movement and music and joy. I also think about just a lot of what was being said made me think about marginalized. And I really appreciate what Rosie said about that. I think about and see and work towards a future where I will never use that word again. And as you know, what else can we do in solidarity and in our work, and what centering of marginalized communities can actually look like? What if it was a place that we start from? Not the box that we check or that we tell donors, and I get it, funding is real. And that we include them in our approach, but what if it was, and those populations were the place that we start from in every idea, in every program, in every service, in every conversation, that was the start. Because we do know, as Rosie so eloquently and beautifully said, if Indigenous woman who is differently abled can access or benefit from that particular thing, then we all do. So what if that was our start and our centering?
Thank you, Aisha. And the invitation to answer, I would say, for me, it started with my own work. I mean, I had to really do my own work around understanding the the history of our country, and carrying with that a deep responsibility to help undo the harm, and not from a place of guilt or shame, but just a deep understanding of the systems and how I can move through any given day with the privileges I have and not experience the same kind of microaggressions or significant oppressions or violence that many other folks do in our country. So it started with me. It had to start with my own work, which comes from deep listening, and really being willing to move back and really embrace and create space with the power I have for the leadership and the voices and the lived experience of anyone who's experienced harm. But it started with my own work first. So other questions in the audience? Thank you, Dalton.
Being in rural North Idaho in particular, but rural Idaho, we don't visibly see a lot of people of color. We're just now seeing more queer people come out in our area because of the work that we're doing. And I am very guilty of, I'm owning this, of saying, well, we don't have people of color here, so we can't invite them to the table. And that's bull. I know that to be true. So how do we figure out strategies to reach out to make sure that we are extending that true invitation? As I say, it's not just inviting people to the dance, but it's dancing with them. And being able, when we were talking earlier, keeping an empty seat at our table, especially at a board meeting or at some of our other meetings, to be able to say, we know people are missing, but how do we extend that hand? How do we make that space for all of us? Because we believe in this, and we want to choose all of us, and we want to be inclusive, and we know we're falling short. And we know we use the excuse because Idaho's 98% white, and that's not okay, and I know that. And we want to change that. And so I'm asking for your help in some real strategy on how to do that.
So we wrestle with this question. Again, I like work in New York City, but let me just share what I think might be a parallel sort of problem that we have is how do we involve youth in an organization that serves youth, right? And so how do you make it worth it for people of color in our context with youth, right? Do you have childcare? Are there Metro cards? Is there food? Is there a mentoring program? Like, what are the conditions that you set up so that it's not just, what is it? How is it meaningful for that person? And also not in a tokenizing way such that, so what's that, black perspective? Or, what's the, Latinx perspective? And so I think that involves maybe figuring out, who are the communities of folks, or what are the lessons learned from other people who've done that intentionally, and also creating meaningful access points that allow for that participation to be genuine. Because again, in the context of working with young people who some of whom are in school and parenting and undocumented, if I want their opinion, I have to recognize that their time is incredibly valuable and limited. And then if they want to come to a meeting, what is my responsibility for an organization to make that space meaningful? Does it mean in my case, a lift home and back? And what does it mean to not do that in a way that just, again, is just completely tokenizing? So I think there's probably a series of conversations that you need to have with what are the, where are the POC folks going, or who else has modeled this, and how else have they figured that out? But I'm open to y'all other suggestions as well.
Yeah, I think part of it is also modeling. We talk about healthy relationships, but what do healthy relationships look like between more mainstream organizations and those that are perhaps led by people of color, or bringing people into the to the work? And one of the big challenges we have, even in areas that are very diverse, is many times people of color are truly an afterthought. It's after the program has been developed and the agenda has been planned and the grant has been pretty much written, and it's oh, we need a person of color so that we can say that this is included. And there may be a genuine, all of a sudden, desire, but people are invited to the table after a lot of the decisions have been made. And it's very, it's very tokenizing, it's very demeaning. And so then people come there, it's like, look, this is our agenda, our plan, our strategy, you know, join us. And it really has to be about how do you co-create, going back, I think, to what Adrian was saying this morning, like, how do we get people involved early on and say, I want you to help co-create this and be a part of it. And in so doing, like you say, compensating for the time, too. This happened with the Domestic Violence Homicide Prevention Initiative, that OVW funded a number of sites to replicate this, you know, some of the programs to try to reduce DV homicide. And in these cities, you know, all of a sudden, like at the last second, they said, oh, let's bring, the culture-specific TA organizations. Can you, like, throw some culture-specific, you know, dust over this? And it was like, you know, like those models in and of themselves, like you're asking to replicate it, like they weren't even created taking people of color into account when you created this model. But then to boot, like you said, even in New York, it was tough to get people of color to show up, too, because all of a sudden, like the ones who had the grant and had all the money, then send an email to someone, come join our advisory council. But you're reaching out to under-resourced, community-based organizations spread really thin. So we had to, you know, encourage them, to sort of they ultimately ended up rewriting the way the money was going to be allocated to share resources, because it has to be about sharing resources, literally compensating people for their time, and then being willing to have them come in and maybe challenge, like, you know, this isn't quite going to even work for our communities, and how not to get defensive, but say, all right, let's sort of co-create something maybe a little bit differently then that really does take you into, you know, into consideration. So it really has to be a legitimate opportunity to have a voice at the table.
I think the other piece I would add too, Julie, is that we really have to be, when we talk about the danger of the single story, Idaho is not white. Let's look around the room here. And what we know is we have a growing Latinx population of 10, 14, 15%. We can't rely on census data. We have, you know, robust tribal communities and reservations. And so, I mean, they're in refugee communities. So we really have a really rich, diverse population. And it's just like, how do we make sure everyone is visible? How do we make sure everyone's visible? And how do we engage in conversations that are not transactional, or certainly not an afterthought? That's like worst possible scenario. Question.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Exactly. That Idaho is not all white. It's not 98% white. Idaho is possibly 90%, 87%, something like that. But the Latino population is all over the state. Recently, I was in Lewiston. Lewiston is part of northern Idaho, right? Lewiston? Okay, we have a college there, community college, and also in Moscow, which is northern Idaho, we have the University of Idaho, and there is a percentage of students there. They live there in Moscow. One of my kids went to University of Idaho, so I know there. I'm familiar with the area. There are a lot of agricultural workers in northern Idaho, So, and organizations, Latino organizations are working all over the state. It's very hard for us, you know, sometimes, but all of us are involved all over the state of Idaho. No, we're not, we're there. We exist. We're here. And I talk to people sometimes, you know, they say things like, well, you know, people in Europe can speak lots of languages because they're exposed to other people. They're exposed to other cultures. I always say, hello. Idaho, we have Native Americans, we have Hispanics. You could speak a lot of languages if you want to, if you have the desire. We have a lot of universities where you can learn to speak a foreign language. There's a possibility only if you want to, you have the desire. Also, I'm very involved in the history of Idaho for that reason, because I've been in Idaho. I grew up in Mexico, in Chihuahua, in the northern part of Mexico, and I've been in Idaho for 43 years, okay? Raised my kids here and everything. Well, I've been very involved with the history of the Mexican people in Idaho because the same reason. I've gone through that type of treatment of discrimination where people say, we don't exist. Okay, so I got involved with a lot of people who were interested in the history of the Latinos in Idaho. Well, we were the first ones to be here. After the Native Americans, the Mexicans were here first. Our history goes back to the beginning of the 1800s. There's stories about us. So we decided to form a committee, and we wrote our history. And there are a couple of books already. It's already been 10 years since we published the first book. That is Jesus Urquidez, Idaho's premier muleteer, because there was a Mexican neighborhood in Idaho, right here in Boise, in Maine and Broadway, and it was a Mexican community of cowboys, mule packers, miners, and they contributed greatly to the state of Idaho, okay? In Lewiston, in those areas, we have names like Orofino. It was Mexicans were all over the state of Idaho. Mining was the main industry in Idaho, the foundation of our state. And guess who brought the merchandise to the mining towns all over the Idaho, the mountains of Idaho? Guess who did that? Mexican mule packers. Yeah, and our history is not being told. It's not being told. That's why we formed that committee and we wrote that book. And professors from Boise State has helped us to put it into the school system. We have also a project that we wrote our history because we have so many stories, and you're talking about we have to tell our stories. Not only mule packers here, cowboys. Out of every 3 cowboys or 4 cowboys, 3 were Mexicans. We were the experts in cattle handling. Okay, and so we go to Pocatello, and we have lots of history in Pocatello too. Wherever you go, you have history. So I'm just mortified sometimes, when I hear that we don't exist. And we have such a great history. We have so much to offer as Latinos in Idaho. We have so much to offer. Our culture is so rich and musical, beautiful. And all we see, and that's why I got involved in the community, because all I could see when I came to Idaho back in '74, negative articles in the newspaper. They will focus a lot on the shootings and, this whatever was happening in the Mexican communities, they only focus on the negative. This is why I got this passion about, wait a minute, I'm going to raise my kids here in this state. Something has to be done. We have to activate. And I've been working for a long time, but we have a lot of work to do. Look at us. We are here. We have a couple of books about our history. There, we put our books in every library in the state of Idaho. All over the libraries, you find a book that we just published in 2014 called 150 Years of Idaho Latino History. It's a bilingual book, and it has all of our stories from 1860 to 2013. So I invite you to look at it in every library in the state of Idaho has our history there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kelly, can I add something to that really quickly?
Yes.
Something that was interesting about that question was this idea about inviting people to the table. And I don't know if folks are aware of this or not, but when I travel to Idaho, because I'm working on a project with the Coalition to bring a support line to incarcerated survivors, when I do business here, there's only one accessible van rental place in the entire state of Idaho. And so as somebody who's not from here and maybe can't use like Access or something like that because I'm just not familiar with how that works here, they employ folks who actually have disabilities at this particular car rental place. And so I've gotten to know a wonderful gentleman by the name of Tim, and he was sharing with me just yesterday that, when it snows, because I've never been out here in November, December months, and he said, oh yeah, when it's snowing, I literally just try to sort of limit where I go, and I just kind of go from point A to point B until the weather clears. And so when I think about inviting people to the table, and I think about those particular circumstances that don't apply to me living in Southern California, to me that means where the table is located has to change because we can't physically get there.
Thanks, Vanessa. I think we have time for 2 more. Dolphin?
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank you for sharing your wisdom. And I have a question about truth. And maybe you can speak a little bit about what is the value or the worth of truth nowadays when we kind of live in a, pathological lying environment, and it became such a, normalized situation. It became normalized that people lie, and I'm talking about politicians just like not even blinking, not apologizing, not even say, well, misspoke or something like that. So I was just wondering about how it can be addressed, not only in the individual level, but also in the communal level of organizing, and how do you, defeat this pathological state of lying.
Thanks, Rosie.
No, I think you've identified, what is a real critical issue of our time. And in fact, I was at a convening yesterday in D.C. before flying out here, and Esther Soler, who works with Futures, said she was at a focus group in a part of California with voters who were considered moderate, independents. This is sort of a little bit of an aside, but anyways, she was saying they were asking them about the Me Too movement, and there were literally a lot of women there who did not know what it was, who had not seen it. And she said it was sort of shocking. I know we were all, and so I think there's two things going on. One is people are living in their own bubbles, their own universe, right? Where they're only seeing some stories and seeing the Twitter feeds and the news and whatever from those who they consider part of their community. And so that is a huge challenge as we try to build solidarity and cross-understanding. And then the second part that you identified is, as people now, truth is almost becoming relative. You can create your own truth to suit your own narrative. And how do we challenge that? And so I think we do, part of it is we are going to have to figure out how to break down some of these walls and cross over, right? And it's hard because it's more comfortable to speak in a room like this and to speak with those, that we share this goal. But if we continue to just, go further and further into our own bubbles, then it's going to get worse, and then people won't even be aware of our narratives. So for example, the Me Too narrative, and simultaneously also be hearing false narratives that then just become the stories that are told. So I think it is an interesting question, an interesting challenge for all of us. How do we get out of our comfort zone? And I know my family is split. And we have this annual every 5 years we have a family reunion, and next year it's going to be coming up. And we're all worried because it's like, some of us are like, I think I'm going to skip that family reunion. I don't want to see so-and-so who voted for whoever. And then it's like, somehow we got to show up. We got to show up, and we got to find common ground, and we got to figure out how to keep dialoguing, because if not, these narratives are going to keep going in opposite directions. So I challenge all of us to figure out, how do we find those safe spaces where we have commonality, where we're strengthened in our solidarity, but how are we also going to get out of our comfort zone? Because part of there was some work on implicit bias, how much implicit bias exists, right? We all have a certain amount of implicit bias by what we're seeing and breathing around us. But one of the ways that you address it, they say, is you have to be proactive. You have to engage with those who are different. You have to build those relationships. That's the only way you're going to see not just what's different, but what really unifies us. So I think, I challenge all of us to keep figuring out how we're going to reach out to these other communities.
That's great. Was there one more question? And then we'll say our thank yous.
Actually, mine isn't really a question. It's appreciation for the young person over there for asking such a hard question, for the University of Idaho for bringing Anita Hill to Idaho, and many of your other great speakers that you bring before the Me Too hit the fan, before all of that happened, and to all of you up there for all of the comments that you've made today. And what I really want to speak to is my message, which is of hope and belief that it is rooted here in the young people. Today there were people here from high school. I was blown away when I was all excited about meeting Anita Hill and listening to her speak and going to a seminar and seeing all the men there saying how their viewpoints had changed about what was sexual harassment, and then going back to the young people of my community, and they had no clue. So of course I felt it was my duty to inform them, because I believe that's where our hope and our change lies. And I think that making sure that everybody's at the table is that key to every time you show show up, we all show up for one of your conferences, is compassion. Is that the way you get everybody to the table, whether they have the outer appearance as a male or a female or a white, my young children's look, my boys are white and tall, and they look like they've come from privilege, but yet they're out there marching and they're out there doing things that they're trying to change our world because they have been taught compassion. So again, my hope and thanks to you for all of the work that you do is that we're rooted in compassion and teaching that compassion for others in our youth, that some of these stories will be heard from them because they have a tendency to believe the history books. So it's our duty as everybody here to get the story straight from the people and tell the stories that we've acknowledged today. So thank you, and thank you for all the work that everybody's doing here.
Thanks. All right, we're at the end. I just want to, are there any very last things that you need to release? We feel good? All right, so Patina, Rosie, Aisha, Vanessa, Andrew, Nadiah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you to everyone for coming. Yard, any announcements? All right, we'll see everyone tomorrow. Thank you so much again to the great, amazing panelists and for sharing all of your stories today.
Am I as prideful as you say that I am? I mumble loudly and work through the silence. The only thing constant is your humble presence. To the other side of the world, get ready for the